Welcome to Ghost Stories of the Battles, your passage to the spectral remnants of history's great struggles. Today, we explore the haunting tales from Pearl Harbor, where the spirits of the fallen linger at the USS Arizona Memorial. In the waters off Oahu, the USS Arizona lies quietly beneath the waves, a sunken tomb for more than 100 sailors who lost their lives during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The wreck is a solemn reminder of the surprise strike that catapulted the United States into World War II. Above the site, the USS Arizona Memorial floats serenely, welcoming visitors from around the world who come to pay their respects. But for some, the memorial holds more than just history. It holds echoes of the past. Veterans, staff, and tourists have reported seeing shadowy figures, hearing muffled cries, and even smelling the acrid scent of smoke and burning oil. Some believe these phenomena are the spirits of the sailors, trapped in the moment of their fiery demise. This is the story of the USS Arizona, a place where the past still lingers, and the spirits of the fallen remain close to the surface. Story 1. The Shadow and the Oil. The USS Arizona Memorial sat serenely over the sunken battleship, a stark white structure contrasting against the turquoise waters of Pearl Harbor. For decades, it had stood as a solemn tribute to the 177 sailors who lost their lives during the attack on December 7, 1941. Beneath its surface, the ship lay as it had fallen, a tomb for those who had never escaped its fiery destruction. Alan Nakamura knew the memorial well. He had worked as a guide and caretaker for 10 years, escorting visitors through the floating structure and recounting the tragic history of the Arizona. He loved his job, feeling a personal connection to the site. His great-uncle had been aboard the ship when it sank, one of the many whose bodies had never been recovered. But even Alan, who thought he knew the memorial better than anyone, couldn't explain what he saw one evening as the sun set over the harbor. The evening tours had wrapped up, and the last ferry of visitors had departed the memorial, leaving Alan alone to close up. He often relished these quiet moments, a chance to reflect on the weight of the history surrounding him. The stillness of the harbor was calming, with only the occasional lapping of waves against the structure breaking the silence. He made his rounds, ensuring no one lingered behind. The sun dipped lower, painting the water in hues of orange and gold. Alan walked to the railing overlooking the wreckage, leaning over to observe the tears of the Arizona, the oil droplets that continued to seep from the ship's hull, rising to the surface like liquid memories of that fateful day. As he stared at the shimmering slick, something caught his eye. A shadow moving beneath the surface. At first, Alan dismissed it as a fish or a trick of the light. But as he watched, the shadow grew more distinct. It moved deliberately, almost as if walking along the deck of the sunken ship. He squinted, leaning closer to the water. The shape resembled a human figure, upright and purposeful, its outline wavering slightly in the rippling current. "Is someone there?" Alan called out instinctively, though he knew it was impossible. The shadow stopped. For a moment, it seemed to turn toward him. Alan felt an inexplicable chill, as if a cold wind had passed through him. His heart pounded in his chest. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved into the depths, leaving only the faint shimmer of oil behind. Alan returned to the visitor center that evening, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the shadow from his thoughts. It hadn't moved like a fish or a stray piece of debris. It had moved like a person, calm, steady, deliberate. The next day, he casually asked one of his colleagues if they had ever seen anything unusual near the wreck. "Unusual how?" his colleague asked. "Lake. His shadow's in the water," Alan said, hesitant to sound foolish. The colleague chuckled. "Oh, you've seen it, huh?" "Yeah, a few of us have. Usually at dusk, just before the light fades. Some say it's one of the sailors, still walking his post." Alan frowned. "You're joking, right?" "I'm serious," the man said, his expression sobering. "A lot of people believe the spirits of the crew are still down there. You've heard the stories, haven't you? Alan had heard the stories. Whispers among the staff about ghostly figures, unexplained sounds, and eerie sensations. He had always dismissed them as local legends, tales spun to add a layer of mystique to the already somber site. But now, he wasn't so sure. A week later, Alan stayed late again, determined to see if the shadow would return. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the harbor was bathed in the dim glow of twilight. Alan stood by the railing, his gaze fixed on the water below. At first, there was nothing. The surface was calm, reflecting the deepening hues of the sky. But as he stared, the shadow emerged once more, gliding across the wreck like a sentinel patrolling its post. Alan's breath caught. This time, the figure seemed more defined. He could make out the faint suggestion of arms and legs, even the rounded curve of a head. The shadow paused, hovering near what he knew to be the ship's forward deck. "Who are you?" Alan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. The shadow turned toward him again, and Alan felt a cold wave wash over him. He couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a mixture of fear and awe. And then, in the fading light, he heard it, a faint voice, low and steady, carried on the breeze. "Still here." A shaken but resolute, Alan spent the next few days researching the crew of the USS Arizona. He pored over old logs, survivor accounts, and lists of the deceased, searching for any clue that might connect to the shadow he'd seen. One name stood out: Petty Officer Samuel Green. According to survivor accounts, Green had been stationed on the forward deck during the attack. Witnesses reported seeing him trying to guide sailors to safety, even as the ship was consumed by fire. His body was never recovered, and he was presumed to have gone down with the ship. Alan felt a chill as he read the accounts. Could the shadow belong to Green, still performing his duty even in death? Alan returned to the memorial one last time at dusk, carrying a single white flower. He leaned over the railing, watching as the light faded and the harbor grew quiet. "Samuel Green," he said softly, "if you're still here, I just want to say thank you for everything you did." The water remained still, the surface unbroken. Alan sighed, placing the flower on the railing. As he turned to leave, he caught it. The faintest glimpse of the shadow below. This time, it didn't move away. It lingered near the deck, its form clearer than ever. Alan could almost see the outline of a Navy uniform, the set of proud shoulders. The shadow seemed to nod just once, before fading into the depths. Alan never saw the shadow again, but the memory stayed with him. He continued his work at the memorial, sharing the story of Samuel Green with visitors as a way of honoring the fallen. For those who visit the USS Arizona, Alan offers a quiet suggestion. When you look into the water, take a moment to reflect. You might just feel a presence, a reminder that some sacrifices echo far beyond the moment they were made. A story too. The crying sailor Cindy Tran had always been captivated by the stories of World War II. Her grandfather had served in the Pacific, and while he rarely spoke about his experiences, his silence had only deepened her curiosity. When she finally saved enough to visit Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona Memorial was at the top of her list, a sacred place where history felt alive and the weight of sacrifice was palpable. Cindy didn't expect to leave the memorial feeling shaken in a way she couldn't explain. The solemn walls bore more than the names of the fallen. They carried whispers of sorrow and loss that refused to fade. And one voice, in particular, would haunt her forever. The day Cindy visited was bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed at odds with the tragedy the site represented. As the ferry approached the white structure that floated above the sunken USS Arizona, Cindy felt a chill despite the warmth of the Hawaiian sun. She stepped onto the platform, her footsteps echoing slightly against the polished floor. Visitors spoke in hushed tones, their voices subdued by the solemnity of the space. Cindy moved toward the wall engraved with the names of the 177 sailors who had perished aboard the Arizona. She ran her fingers lightly over the marble, her heart heavy. So many names, so many lives cut short. As Cindy lingered, a strange sensation settled over her. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and a faint pressure built in her chest. She brushed it off as emotion, the natural response to standing in a place so steeped in history. Then she heard it. It started as a soft sound, almost imperceptible over the gentle lapping of the waves. A faint, rhythmic sobbing. Cindy froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, filled with sorrow and despair. She turned, expecting to see another visitor overcome with emotion. But the memorial was nearly empty. A few tourists stood at the far end, their backs turned to her. The crying seemed to be coming from the wall itself. Cindy's pulse quickened as she walked slowly along the wall, following the sound. It grew louder, more distinct. A man's voice, muffled and choked with tears. "Hello." Cindy called out, her voice trembling. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She stood still, her breath shallow, unsure of what she had just experienced. Trying to shake off the unease, she turned back toward the center of the memorial. That's when she saw him. Near the wall of names stood a young man in a Navy uniform. His back was to her. His shoulders slumped as though carrying an unbearable weight. His hands rested lightly on the marble, his head bowed. Cindy's first thought was that he was a reenactor, perhaps part of a historical program. But something about him felt off. His figure seemed to shimmer faintly, as if he were caught between this world and another. "Excuse me," she said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Are you okay?" The man turned slowly, and Cindy's breath caught in her throat. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and rimmed with dark circles. Tears streamed down his cheeks, leaving faint trails that glistened unnaturally in the sunlight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. Shaken, Cindy left the memorial and returned to the visitor center. She approached a staff member, her voice barely steady. "Has anyone ever seen anything strange at the Arizona Memorial?" The staff member raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" "Like someone crying. Or a man in a Navy uniform." The staff member's expression softened. "You're not the first to see him," she said quietly. "People have reported a sailor standing near the wall of names, crying. Some think he's mourning his shipmates who never left the ship." "Do you know who he is?" Cindy asked. The woman shook her head. "No one knows for sure. But there was a survivor who lost his brother on the Arizona. He visited the memorial often before he passed. Some people think his spirit returns to watch over the ship and the men who stayed behind." That night, Cindy couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, replaying the encounter in her mind. The man's sorrow had felt so real, so overwhelming. She couldn't shake the image of his tear-streaked face. The next morning, she returned to the memorial. The crowd was larger this time, but Cindy made her way to the wall of names, searching for something, anything, that might connect her to the man she had seen. Her eyes landed on a pair of names, Lieutenant Robert Hayes and Seaman James Hayes. Brothers, both lost aboard the Arizona. Cindy's chest tightened as she read their ranks, imagining the bond they must have shared. She knelt and placed her hand on the cool marble. "If it was you," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I hope you found peace." As Cindy stood to leave, a faint breeze brushed past her, carrying with it the scent of salt and something faintly floral, like plumeria blossoms. She turned, and for a brief moment, she saw him again. The sailor standing by the wall. This time he wasn't crying. He stood tall, his expression calm, almost grateful. Cindy blinked, and he was gone. But in his place, a single white flower lay on the ground, its petals untouched by the wind. Cindy left Pearl Harbor with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: the USS Arizona Memorial was more than a tribute to the past. It was a bridge between worlds, a place where the spirits of the fallen still lingered. For those who visit, the memorial offers not only a chance to honor history, but to feel the presence of those who gave their lives. And for Cindy, The crying sailor was a poignant reminder that some sacrifices are too profound to fade into silence. Story 3. The smell of smoke. The USS Arizona Memorial had always been a place of deep reverence for Navy sailors like Petty Officer Mark Ramirez. Standing on its platform, looking down at the wreckage and tomb below, was a stark reminder of the sacrifices made on December 7, 1941. Mark had heard the stories of Pearl Harbor's haunting beauty, but for him, it was the embodiment of duty and honor. When he visited the memorial with his fellow sailors in 2017, he expected to feel solemn respect. What he didn't expect was an encounter that would shatter his understanding of the past and connect him, in a visceral way, to the men who had perished there. The day began like any other training exercise. Mark and a group of his shipmates had been assigned to visit the memorial as part of a Navy tradition, honoring those who had gone before them. The sun blazed overhead as the ferry carried them across the harbor, the white structure of the memorial growing larger in the distance. Mark leaned against the railing, watching the faint shimmer of oil on the water. The Tears of the Arizona, as they were called. He'd always thought the term was poetic, but now, seeing it in person, it felt eerily alive. "Feels different being here, doesn't it?" said Lieutenant Carter, standing beside him. Mark nodded. "It does. Like the place remembers." As the group disembarked and began their tour of the memorial, Mark was struck by the stillness of the place. Despite the soft murmurs of visitors and the distant hum of the city, there was a quiet intensity in the air, as though the site held its breath. Mark stood at the railing, staring down at the ship's rusted remains. The names etched into the marble wall nearby seemed to hum with unspoken stories. As he leaned closer to the water, he caught the faintest whiff of something sharp and acrid. He frowned, sniffing the air. It smelled like smoke, thick and oily, with a metallic tang that burned his nostrils. "Do you smell that?" he asked the sailor beside him. "Smell what?" "Smoke," Mark said. "Like something's burning." The sailor shook his head. "Maybe it's the ferry exhaust," but Mark knew it wasn't. The smell was too distinct, too out of place in the pristine harbor air. The scent grew stronger as Mark moved along the platform. His chest tightened, and his breath quickened as the smell invaded his senses. The world around him seemed to blur, the murmurs of visitors fading into a low, ominous hum. Mark suddenly felt as though he were somewhere else. His vision darkened, and when it cleared, he was no longer on the memorial. He was on the deck of the USS Arizona. But it wasn't the silent wreck he'd seen moments ago. It was alive with chaos and fire. Flames engulfed the ship, smoke billowing into the sky. Sailors ran in every direction, shouting orders and cries for help. The sound was deafening. The roar of explosions, the shriek of tearing metal. The desperate screams of men trapped below deck. Mark stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see them burned or covered in soot. But they were clean. The vision shifted again, and he saw the moment the Arizona's forward magazine exploded. The fireball rose into the sky, sending a shockwave through the ship. Mark felt the heat against his face, the blast reverberating in his chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision ended. Mark found himself back on the memorial, gasping for air. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to his senses, though no one else seemed to notice it. He leaned against the railing, his legs trembling. "Ramirez, you okay?" Lieutenant Carter asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. Mark nodded, though his face was pale. "Yeah. I think I need a minute." Carter frowned but didn't press further. "Take your time." Mark walked to a quieter part of the memorial, away from the crowd. He sat down on a bench, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the vividness of the vision. The sounds, the smell of burning oil and metal. It had felt real. More real than anything he'd ever experienced. That evening, back at the base, Mark shared his experience with a chaplain. The older man listened intently, his expression grave. "You're not the first to feel something out there," the chaplain said. The Arizona is more than just a memorial. It's a graveyard, a place where over 1,000 souls were lost in an instant. It's bound to carry an energy, especially for someone like you. Someone like me? Mark asked. Someone who serves, the chaplain replied. The men who died there were sailors, just like you. Maybe what you experienced was their way of reaching out, reminding you of the cost of war. Mark nodded slowly. It made sense, but it didn't make it any less unsettling. A week later, Mark returned to the USS Arizona Memorial on his own. The air was cooler that day, the sky overcast. As the ferry approached the site, Mark felt a familiar heaviness settle over him. He walked to the railing, staring down at the wreckage. The smell of smoke didn't return, but he could still feel the echoes of what he had experienced. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He had written a letter addressed to the sailors of the Arizona, a gesture of respect and gratitude. He placed the letter on the railing and whispered, "Thank you for everything you gave." For a moment, he thought he saw a faint shimmer in the water, a ripple that seemed out of place. Then it was gone, and the harbor was still again. Mark carried the memory of that day with him for the rest of his life. He never spoke of it to his fellow sailors, but he often thought of the vision and the lives lost aboard the USS Arizona. For Mark, the memorial was more than a place of remembrance. It was a connection to the past, a reminder of the human cost of duty and sacrifice. And though he couldn't fully explain what he had experienced, he knew it was something he would never forget. Story 4. The tapping on the deck. Pearl Harbor at night was a place of serene beauty and profound silence. For security guard Sam Kiloa, who worked the graveyard shift at the USS Arizona Memorial, those quiet hours were when he felt closest to history. Sam took pride in his job, knowing he was protecting a site that stood as a testament to bravery and sacrifice. But late one night, Sam heard a sound that would stay with him forever. A sound that seemed to echo not just through the harbor, but across time. Sam's shift began at 10:00 p.m., after the last ferry departed and the memorial was closed to the public. Most nights were uneventful, filled with routine patrols and paperwork. Occasionally, a stray visitor lingered too long, or a wayward tourist boat drifted too close to the restricted area. He liked walking the platform, the cool breeze off the harbor carrying the faint scent of salt and oil. Sam often paused to look down at the wreckage of the USS Arizona, its rusted remains barely visible beneath the surface. To him, the site wasn't just a memorial. It was sacred ground. It was a calm night in early spring. The harbor was still, the moon casting a pale glow over the water. Sam was making his usual rounds when he heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, he thought it was nothing more than the wind rattling a loose railing or perhaps a bird pecking at the structure. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking lightly on metal. He paused, listening closely. The tapping came from beneath the platform, near the center of the memorial. Frowning, Sam leaned over the railing and shone his flashlight into the water. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wreck below. The surface rippled gently, but there was no sign of movement. The tapping stopped. Shrugging it off, Sam continued his patrol, though an uneasy feeling lingered. The tapping returned the following night, louder and more insistent. This time, it seemed to move, echoing from different points beneath the memorial. Sam felt a chill as he listened. It didn't sound like an animal or the creak of the platform. It sounded like someone trying to get his attention. He radioed the mainland. "This is Kiloha. I'm hearing some strange noises out here. Anyone else picking this up?" "Negative," came the reply. "Probably just the water." "Sam, the harbor's full of surprises." Sam wasn't convinced. He walked the length of the platform, his flashlight sweeping the water. As he reached the far end, the tapping grew louder, reverberating through the structure. He leaned over the railing again, his heart pounding. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible beneath the surface. But as Sam stared, the shape became clear: a hand, pale and ghostly, reaching upward. He staggered back, dropping his flashlight. The hand vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the water calm and undisturbed. Sam stood frozen, his mind racing. He retrieved his flashlight and shone it into the water again, but there was nothing there. His pulse hammered in his ears as he radioed the mainland again. "There's something in the water," he said, his voice shaking. "Say again." "I saw a hand. Someone's down there." There was a pause before the reply. "Sam, the Arizona is a sealed grave. No one's down there. You're probably just seeing reflections." Sam knew what he'd seen, unable to let go of the experience. Sam spent the next day researching the history of the USS Arizona. He read about the sailors trapped below deck during the attack, pounding on the hull in desperation as the ship sank. Some survivors had reported hearing those frantic knocks as they swam to safety, the sounds haunting them for the rest of their lives. Sam found an account from a man named Lieutenant Henry Scott, who described hearing tapping coming from the engine room as he clung to wreckage in the water. "I'll never forget the sound," Scott had written. "It was the sound of men trying to escape, but we couldn't help them. We couldn't save them." Sam felt a lump in his throat as he imagined those sailors, their final moments spent in darkness, surrounded by fire and water. The following night, Sam returned to the memorial with a mixture of dread and determination. He didn't know what he hoped to find, but he felt compelled to understand. The harbor was eerily quiet, the water as smooth as glass. Sam walked the platform, listening intently. The tapping began again, faint at first but growing louder. This time, it was accompanied by another sound, a muffled voice, low and indistinct, like someone calling out from far away. Sam leaned over the railing, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The tapping grew louder, more urgent. "Who's there?" he called, his voice breaking. The water rippled, and for a moment, Sam thought he saw a face beneath the surface, pale and ghostly, its eyes wide with fear. He gasped, stumbling back. The tapping stopped, and the harbor fell silent once more. The next morning, Sam visited the wall of names etched into the memorial. He ran his fingers over the cool marble, stopping at the name of an engine room sailor whose story he had read the night before, Chief Petty Officer William Grayson. "Is it you?" Sam whispered. "Are you still down there?" He placed a small offering, a lei of white flowers, on the railing. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry we couldn't save you." For a moment, the air felt lighter, the weight of the previous night's lifting. Sam turned to leave, glancing back one last time. He thought he saw a ripple in the water, a faint acknowledgement from the depths. Sam never heard the tapping again, but he carried the memory with him for the rest of his life. He often told visitors that the USS Arizona Memorial was more than a tribute to the past. It was a living connection to the men who had made the ultimate sacrifice. And for those who listened closely, the harbor still carried their echoes, reminding the world of a promise never to forget. The USS Arizona is more than a memorial. It is a bridge between the living and the dead, a place where the past feels startlingly present. Whether these experiences are the result of lingering spirits or the weight of history, they remind us of the lives cut short on that fateful day in December 1941. For those who visit, the USS Arizona Memorial is a place of reflection, reverence, and perhaps a reminder that some sacrifices echo far beyond the grave.